Well, good evening and welcome to this live stream. Can you believe it? It's the 18th of June, 2024. Martin North here from Digital Finance Analytics. Great to have you on the stream tonight. And I'm going to have a really interesting conversation with Leith with regard to some of the economic data and some of the more political aspects of this too, because you can't really completely strip out politics from all of this. Just before I bring Leith in, let me just remind you, as I always do, we're not providing specific financial or legal advice. This is a general conversation. Please play nice in the chat, but feel free to add your comments and questions in. As I said, the chat system is a bit different tonight, so I may or may not show chat on screen, but we can definitely get those questions in. If you'd like to ask a question specifically to either of us, then use that Walk the World. That'll get my attention. I've enabled Super Chat. If you'd like to make your contribution to what we do, or indeed get your question top of the list, you can use Super Chat to do that. Always greatly appreciated and helps to cover some of the costs of what we do. Anyway, let me bring Leith in and we'll get started straight away. Hey, Leith, how you doing?
Yeah, good. Thanks, Martin. Yourself?
Very good. Good to have you back on. Boy, you've got a bit of a media tart going on there with all the Sky stuff and everything else, and Brisbane and all sorts of places.
Yeah, look, I must admit, look, the Sky stuff's fine, but they're always, very short interviews. So we're talking about, you get like 3 minutes, 5 minutes, whatever. So you don't really touch on anything in detail. What I really like doing is actually the radio stuff. So I've got 2 weekly spots in Radio 2GB where we do these very long, in-depth interviews, which go from anywhere between, 10 to 20 minutes. And that's the stuff I actually enjoy doing, because you can pretty much talk, with a fair bit of detail into things. And that's, I much prefer doing radio than TV, I must admit. But at the same time, I'm doing tonight here. Tomorrow, I'm doing an interview with Catherine Cashmore at the tomorrow morning. It probably won't air tomorrow morning. And then I got tomorrow night 2GB, which we pre-record for Thursday morning. And then Thursday lunchtime, I've got another interview. And then, Saturday, my usual Saturday morning gig with 2GB, and probably another Sky interview in there somewhere. So, yeah, it certainly keeps me very busy. But I guess it's, better that people want to interview than not interview. So, I've just kind of said to myself about a year ago, I'm going to just say yes and see where it takes me. And, yeah, it's been pretty good so far.
Excellent. I agree with you. The radio stuff is, you can get into more detail. And
plus I can do it in my pajamas. So it's good.
Yeah, the mind boggles. No, absolutely. Well, look, there's so much to talk about. And I called this the housing poker game, right? Because what I've watched in the last few weeks is all of the states throwing money at housing, right? We had, the federal budget. We had all sorts of people trying to sort of put fingers in the dike and trying to show they're doing things. And I've got this idea of the announceable. So they want to be seen to be doing stuff, right? And yet the truth is that it's getting worse and worse and worse. The RBA today left rates where they are. And I think we're a bit more hawkish than previously. And I know this is ANZ's now saying next year before any rate cuts. Don't know what you think about that. But to my mind, we've got this mass, poker game going on where you've got politicians trying to play cards to show they're doing stuff, but in reality, it's completely bust.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's pretty much the Australian story, isn't it? It's look, to be fair, it's been like that probably for 20 years. Especially on the housing front. I mean, how many housing inquiries have we had in the past 20 years? I think I went back and tried to calculate it, and this wasn't even including the ones from think tanks and all that sort of stuff. And there was at least a dozen.
Yes.
And, probably more. In fact, if you count the state government levels and all those ones, there's probably been 20. And, every couple of years, they wheel out an inquiry, and then it does the recommendations. They spend millions of dollars of this stuff, get heaps of submissions, and then nothing changes. And, we're seeing the same sort of thing where the solution seems to be, more demand side stimulus, which is, hasn't worked the last 20 years, but we'll just keep doing the same thing. And, it's similar with the cost of living relief. I mean, rather than, but basically we've got Band-Aid budgets left, right and center. And, it doesn't matter if it's state or federal or whatever. It's basically just Band-Aids over Band-Aids trying to cover up, structural policy failures at, all levels of government. And we saw it today with the New South Wales budget, where they've basically come out and, promised to magically build 30,000 homes, which is like, well, hang on. that sounds great. It sounds a bit like Albo's target and Victoria's target and everyone else's target. But it's like, well, hang on, where are the builders going to come from? Where is the concrete going to come from? Where's all the other materials going to come from? We've got shortages and everything. Wouldn't it be a lot simpler to just lower immigration to a level that's compatible with the nation's ability to build homes and infrastructure, rather than running at full tilt and then hoping to magically ramp supply up to match your insane population flows? So the whole thing's just a shell game, really. Let's face it.
Yeah, and I think the gap between what particularly some of the states are saying and what they're doing and what needs to be done is so wide. I also think, interestingly, of course, we've had quite a lot of money being thrown at everybody, from the federal budget, which will actually put, tax into people's pockets. We've got Queensland throwing money around like you wouldn't believe, with ultra cheap travel and all sorts of things going on up there. Interestingly, Michelle Bullock suggested that some, sort of maybe some of those things could actually impact some of her decisions in terms of what she's going to do. And there are people saying that this is actually quite inflationary in terms of all this money being thrown around. The New South Wales budget in particular, I think, was fascinating. And, we've got the ambitious plans to build the 30,000 homes, right? High interest rates and construction costs have led to the pace of construction slowing to a decade low. Now, let's just contextualize that, Leith, because, of course, Tara Brooker did some analysis to show that we're actually on a per 100,000 basis, we're building more than almost every other Western country.
Oh, yeah.
5.2% of our total population, employed population, is working in construction. So it's it's not like we're not building much.
No. In fact, I've got an updated table, which I've got in tonight's chart pack, which I don't know if you want to go on and go to it now.
Yeah, go if you like.
Might as well. Look, why not? Might as well. So just so everyone knows, this is a chart pack I slapped up in an hour or so, in the hour or so before. So if there's a typos or whatever, don't, that's the way it is. So this table on the left-hand side is basically the number of construction workers per capita.
Yeah. And
this is dragged from the OECD statistics. And it's the latest observation. So the OECD always works a couple of years behind. So, that obviously that population figure for Australia, which is 26 million, is a million behind where we are currently. We're currently at 27 million. So, take all this with a grain of salt. This is the snapshot as of a year or so ago, which is the latest observation they had. But irrespective, according to the OECD, 5.2% of Australia's, population was working in construction, and that's against an OECD average of 3.3%, European Union 3.1. All the data's there. The only country which had more was New Zealand. And, this whole notion that we don't have enough, people working in construction, and in terms of the Australian labour force, it's 9.2% of Australian workers are working in construction as of February. So this whole notion that we don't have enough, construction workers and we're not building enough and all that, the only reason why we've got that is because we're running population growth like a absolute science experiment. And I don't know, should we get on it now, Martin? Should we just rip the Band-Aid off and get right into it?
Yeah, well, just before we do that, I just want to highlight that the capacity to build is being crimped by a lot of public sector building as well. So there's actually contention between building houses and building for the public sector. And there's a lot of government money being thrown in to build stuff, right? Roads.
Enormous amounts.
New airports, things like that. So that's the first thing. The second thing. The second thing is the cost of materials continue to rise. And in fact, all the analysis suggests that we're going to see continued construction costs rising, as well as, of course, the labour costs. So
the insurance costs is the latest one.
Yeah, good. I was going to make exactly that point. So that we've got that. Then, of course, they turn around and blame the planning system. And clearly the planning system is not optimal in terms of actually making decisions to build. But they're all sort of throwing, things at this without understanding the critical fundamental issue, which is the people problem, right? And that's where the migration system has to really be called into question, because at the end of the day, it's a people problem, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It's a people problem. I mean, if you don't mind sharing the screen, I'll just go through the latest migration numbers that came out last week. So, the Australian Bureau of Statistics released the December quarter migration numbers. So, it always runs about 6 months behind. And bearing in mind that the monthly arrivals and departures figures that we get more regularly have also, continued at a very strong pace at the start of this year, which suggests that migration is still very, very high. Now, the hilarious thing about this is the Albanese government has been woefully, understated Australia's expected migration ever since it got into office. So, you might remember it got elected in mid-2022 and then held the Jobs and Skills Summit, where they said, we're going to ramp immigration. We're going to lift the permanent migrant intake to a record level. We're going to get the migrants in. We've got skills shortages left, right, and centre, blah, blah, blah. We're going to spend $42 million of your money to hire 500 additional staff in the Department of Home Affairs to rubber stamp visas as quickly as possible to clear this fake 1 million visa backlog. That's what they said. And despite that, the October 2022 budget, which was held a month after the Jobs and Skills Summit, when they said they were going to ramp immigration to record levels, predicted net overseas migration of just 235,000 for the last financial year. Well, guess what? The official number ended up being just under 540,000. So it was more than double what Labor said. And then fast forward to this current financial year that we're in, the last year's federal budget, so the May budget last year, projected that net overseas migration this financial year would be 315,000. Then December's mid-year economic and fiscal update upgraded that to 375,000. Then the federal budget last month said it's going to be 395,000. And then voila, we got last week's migration numbers, which absolutely blew the roof off. And what it showed is that it actually upgraded the September quarter's peak, which the ABS initially thought was 548,000. It revised it up to 565,000, and then said that into the December quarter we basically fell a little bit back to what they thought was the peak in September, back to about 550,000. Now, the funny thing about that was that in Q3 and Q4 last year, we got a total of 258,300 migrants for the half. And that just leaves 136,700 for this half. So, the 6 months to June 30 this year to meet the federal budget's target or projection of 395,000 net overseas migration. So once again, Labor's going to be caught out. The numbers are going to probably come in closer to 500,000. And, it's going to end up blowing way past their targets, which has been the story since this mob got into office. Now, the hilarious thing about it is they basically pinned the migration boom on the return of migrants after the pandemic, and they said, the reason why net overseas migration's gone up so much is because less migrants are leaving. Well, the chart on the right hand side, which comes from Alex Joyner, who did a great chart here. Well, as you can see, the migrant arrivals we got last calendar year was 751,500. So that's, not including departures. Well, that's about 150,000 more than the pre-pandemic peak. So basically, Labor has just opened the floodgates here. And 84% of Australia's population growth last year came from net overseas migration. That's a record high. The numbers are just off the charts. And basically all it tells you is that, the Labor government's migration forecasts are once again going to be absolutely steamrolled. And they're going to come in way hotter than they projected, despite the fact that they kept, obviously revising up their projections. So basically Labor's lost control of the border. And that's, one of the reasons why we have this absolutely acute rental crisis. And, if you don't mind switching back, Martin, I'll just show this one last chart on Australia's population growth. Now, Australia's population surged by 651,000 last year. Again, 84% of that was in overseas migration. The bigger thing is the long-term chart on the right. Now, this only goes up to 2022 because I grabbed the World Bank's numbers. I wanted to be consistent. I didn't want to, update Australia's, not update everyone else's. And their most recent data only goes up to 2022. But what it shows is if you look at the 22 years this century, Australia's experienced the strongest population growth. So our population's gone up by 37% against an OECD average total of 15%. And we've beaten out Ireland, New Zealand, Canada, everyone else. So if you're wondering why, one of the primary reason why Australia's housing supply never keeps up with demand, it's because of this. It's because in the mid-2000s, the federal government absolutely ramped up immigration. So this used to be the normal sort of level of population growth. They ramped it, and then it's been ramped again after, obviously, the COVID dip. And that there is why we have a rental crisis. But the data on actual housing construction shows that. So Australia built, so this is built, not added, because this isn't including demolitions. Australia built 173,000 homes last year against a population increase of 651,000, which is a massive gap. And to make matters worse, the forward-looking indicators are terrible. So I've got here dwelling approvals on the right. So this is in monthly trend terms. So it's in trend terms to sort of get away, to avoid all the the monthly volatility you get. But if you annualize the monthly trend numbers, Australia's annual rate of dwelling construction is going to run at about 150,000, assuming all those dwelling approvals become completions. And that's about 90,000 below the Albanese government's target of building 240,000 homes a year. So that there is the reason why we have a rental crisis here. The federal government, like, rents dipped at the start of the pandemic when migration turned negative, and then rental growth ramped up, as soon as the government opened the floodgates. And it's the data's all here in front of us. This chart here, by the bottom center chart, this comes from CBA, shows the correlation between population growth across the capital cities since the start of the pandemic and rents. Very strong correlation. We've also got the change in population versus the change in apartment construction. The change in rents versus population versus apartment construction, which is in blue, almost a perfect correlation. So, anyone who's still trying to argue that the rental crisis hasn't been caused by immigration is just basically lying. That is the key driver. We've ramped immigration to record levels. At the same time, we haven't been able to build homes because of all the, supply constraints, building costs, high interest rates, builders competing with state governments for labour against infrastructure projects, loads of builders going under. We've got record insolvencies in the building sector. All those factors have crimped supply, but at the same time, this idiot federal government has decided to ramp immigration to record levels, which is just basically importing renters in the country when there isn't rental properties for these people. Hence, rents have skyrocketed, and we have a rental crisis. None of this is rocket science. It's been delivered to you by this incompetent Albanese government.
Right, and let me just ask the obvious question, which is, of course, from an economic lens, if you think about total GDP, right, the more people you have in the country, the bigger the GDP, because there's more activity, right? So to what extent do you think this high migration has been a deliberate policy that is being set by government and presumably from Treasury to try and support the GDP?
Oh, 100%. Look, there's basically the federal government, the Australian Treasury, which is the puppet master behind Big Australia. I sort of consider the Australian Treasury like a vested interest business lobby. Right, they got their two key performance indicators are obviously to keep the economy ticking over, so just aggregate GDP. That's number one. And number two, which is related to number one, is they want the federal budget to remain strong. So the easiest way to do that is just to pump in the number of people, because obviously more people means more economic activity, which means the economic pie grows, even if the share of the pie doesn't grow. But, unfortunately, the way economics is reported on in Australia and elsewhere is basically a fraud. And, every time the national accounts comes out, the headline figure is Australia's economy grows 0.2% in Q1, when really the headline should have been, Australia's economy shrinks 0.3% in per capita terms, which should have been, what everyone cares about. And look, to be fair, GDP per capita is not a great measure either, but it's a better one than aggregate GDP. But for some reason, because everyone reports on the aggregate, it allows the governments to run these BS, quantitative people in type policies to try and boost the economic pie, not worrying about the share of everyone's pie. Now, the other reason why Treasury loves big Australia is because the federal government collects 82% of the nation's taxes. So if you import a whole bunch of people, most of those people will work, so they'll pay income tax, and it'll also increase company tax, other things equal, and those things flow straight to the federal government. Unfortunately, the cost of that migration tends to fall on the state governments, the local governments, and you and me, because the state governments then become cash strapped. Then they have to sell everything, which is what we're seeing, like massive privatizations, land registries, ports, everything. And then all that ends up doing is it ends up with, you have private monopolies gouging us, and we end up paying higher user charges, so effectively private taxes. So the federal government collects all the benefits. The Australian Treasury loves it because it boosts their two key performance indicators. But unfortunately, their key performance indicators don't include overall welfare and the health of household budgets, state budgets, the natural environment, and all these other things that are basically destroyed when you grow population so aggressively like we have. And that's sort of a long way of answering your question, I guess.
Right. And to add to that, of course, more people need more services. So whether it's healthcare, whether it's driving around, so transport systems, pretty much wherever you look. And one of the reasons why we've got pressure on the healthcare system, again, is because of this massive extra demand that was not really planned for. And, there's been very little planning and there's been very little thinking about how to accommodate this massive number of people coming in, more demand for water, more demand for power, all of those things. So essentially the consequences of the big population move, we're seeing it everywhere now. The other point is worth making that there were quite a few people, I've even heard Albo argue this, well, all we're doing is just replacing the dip that we had through the COVID period, right? Which is the biggest load of BS that I think I've ever seen.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he's not replacing the dip in housing construction, the dip in everything else we had, is he? So he's only focusing on one side of the equation there, which is hence why we have all these shortages everywhere. What an idiot. The fact of the matter is, if you take the housing sector, right, the housing residential construction costs are 30 to 40% higher than they were, depending on the measure, before the pandemic. Well, that wouldn't have happened if we didn't have the pandemic. So this whole notion, we're just catching up. This is ketchup migration. Catch-up migration is just a farce when the supply side hasn't caught up and won't catch up because we've got structurally higher costs. It's just moronic. One of the coalition MPs, I can't remember which one. It was a pretty good analogy he used, I must admit. He said, "Hang on, so if we stop on, if we're driving from Melbourne to Sydney on the Hume Highway and we have to stop for 15 minutes at roadworks, well, you don't drive at 200 kilometres an hour to catch up your lost time. Like, that's just reckless." Well, that's kind of what we've done with migration. It's just stupid. So this whole notion that I hear these big Australia charlatans, like from the ANU. There's this new guy, new propagandist there. He just keeps trying to run the line that, and Abel Rizvi uses it. He goes, Australia's population is still smaller than it was projected in the 2019 budget. Blah 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 blah. It's basically caught up now, anyway. But it's just such a stupid way of looking at it. I mean, nothing else is caught up, which is why we have the problems we have, where demand has run so far ahead of supply. And the other thing is the population forecast in the 2019 budget were ridiculously high anyway. I mean, Australia's been running this big migration Ponzi since the mid-2000s. So it was irresponsible in 2019, and it's even more irresponsible now to do it and to try and do this catch-up. So, the whole thing that we've just got this, so it's already catch-up, is absolutely moronic. This was deliberate. This was deliberate by the Albanese government. They literally staged a fake jobs and skills summit to get a fake consensus to run big migration. And the reason why I say it's fake is because they stacked the summit full of big pro-immigration shills, right? Everyone in there wanted big migration. And they were business lobbyists, property people, universities, the Grattan Institute, who are massive shills. Every shill under the sun was there who supports big Australia. And then Claire O'Neill comes out going, "I can't believe how much consensus there was. Everyone wants high immigration. Gee, we better deliver it." It's like, yeah, because you didn't invite me. You didn't invite all these other people who are against it. You just stacked the cards with big Australia, pro-big Australia shills to get a fake consensus to run a big migration program. And then as soon as the Jobs and Skills Summit were over, the recommendations that came out of it was increase the permanent migrant intake to record levels, increase the humanitarian intake to 20,000 from 13,000. We'll go and employ 500 extra staff in the Department of Home Affairs to rubber stamp visas furiously as fast as we can to clear this fake contrived 1 million visa backlog that didn't exist. And a whole bunch of other things. They ended up extending the amount of hours that students can work. So even now, it's at 24 hours a week. When pre-pandemic it was at 20 hours. That's boosted demand for student visas. They've done a whole bunch of things. They signed two migration deals with India to basically make it easier for Indians to come and work and live in Australia. All these things they've done to deliberately raise immigration to record levels. It's been deliberate. And as a result, we've got a rental crisis. And as a result, the Albanese government is now struggling in the polls and potentially faces becoming a one-term government because they've just cooked the goose on this at the same time as they've failed to address Australia's energy crisis. So, I don't know if you want me to keep ranting on this one, but the fact of the matter is we have engineered magically a gas shortage on Australia's east coast, despite being the equivalent of a Middle Eastern country with oil, or a Middle Eastern oil equivalent country with natural gas. So we are literally swimming in stuff. We are like an Iran, a Saudi Arabia, whatever, of gas. And yet we export literally 82% of our gas in Australia, right? We use more gas, converting it to liquid to then send to China and Japan, mostly China, than our entire households use in this country. And then they want to tell us we've got a gas shortage, and we're paying literally on the East Coast this week $16 a gigajoule for our own gas, which we export 82% of it, while Americans, for example, who are actually the biggest exporters in the world, are paying the equivalent of $4 Australian for their gas. So we're paying 4 times as much as Americans. And you say, well, hang on, how can America be the biggest gas exporter in the world? We were the biggest, they've overtaken us, and pay cheap gas, pay only $4 Australian for their gas per gigajoule, and we're paying $16 on the East Coast. How is that? Well, it's because the US wasn't a pack of idiots like us on the East Coast, and they've reserved their gas for domestic use. They've said, you need to supply Americans first and cheaply, and then you can export the rest. What we've done on the East Coast here is we've said, you can supply everyone else, give our gas away, and we won't even tax you properly for it. And then you can gouge us, which is exactly what they've done. And, so Albo didn't address that either. And as a result, that's been one of the reasons why Australia's inflation's been stubbornly high. Well, both reasons. We've had very high, strong growing rents, and rents are one of the main components of the CPI. So rents have rocketed. And then at the same time, we've had this stubbornly high energy inflation. So we've had high gas prices, but then ergo, we've had high electricity prices because gas is the marginal price setter for electricity as well. So as a result, we've had expensive, we've totally wrecked the gas market. We've delivered ourselves a fake energy shortage, even though we export 82% of it. And we've pushed up the domestic price of gas here, which has then pushed up the domestic price of electricity, which has fed the cost of living crisis, helped feed it, and then feeds into everything. And it's sent our manufacturing industry broke. In the last month, last 6 weeks or so, we lost Australia's last plastics manufacturer, Queenos. They shut down because they can't afford to pay for our gas. So that's another one gone. We had PepsiCo, we've had Nestle, we've had a whole bunch of other manufacturers have said that they're seriously considering leaving Australia because the energy costs, i.e. gas, are too expensive. And this is all because of our idiot policy. I mean, we should have the cheapest energy prices in the world. We'd have lower inflation. But given that we are an energy superpower, swimming in gas, swimming in coal, swimming in power, swimming in all energy other than oil. And yet, through our idiot politicians, we have made this stuff uber expensive while we sell it cheaply to the rest of the world. And we just gouge Australians. And we don't even tax them properly for it. It is absurd. So, as a result, we don't have enough tax revenue. We become super reliant on personal income taxes. And then it's like, okay, well, hang on. We need more tax revenue. Oh, let's just import a whole bunch more migrants because they'll pay tax. Well, how about we broaden the tax base? We tax our resources properly, so we don't need to run this big Australia Ponzi. And we could have all the revenue we need. It's bananas.
Yeah, and the point about the energy, um, you know, mechanism is it underpins everything. So the costs of energy really is the primary lever for success or failure. And when you're actually effectively competing on the international stage at 4 to 5 times what other people are, right? When it's all come from our own backyard, as it were. But again, it's government failure of policy that has actually led to the situation where effectively we're held to ransom by a small number of very large international energy players who clearly are on the inside track in terms of influencing government. And I think the government's probably been quite scared of what they might do. And I would argue that one of the issues we've got here, and look at energy, or you look in the finance sector, or you look in the construction sector, you've got all of these big power blocks who are effectively exerting pressure on government and steering them in a particular direction for their own benefit rather than for the benefit of ordinary Australians. And for me, that's the big lie in all this. That's the big poker game in all of this, which means that the interests of ordinary businesses and ordinary households are just being left at the side.
Yeah, and look, this whole energy failure is just one example of that. I mean, I'd argue it's a very big one, and it's one that I get pretty angry about. I got to admit, because I'm a East Coaster living here, and I'm watching our governments dictate to us that Australians have got to get off gas to meet net zero and all this sort of stuff. And then, actually, Martin, if you don't mind sharing the screen, I'll just this will show the story beautifully. So this chart here in the middle comes from the Australia Institute, but you can say what you like about the Australia Institute, but this chart is 100% correct. So because we've done our own analysis, and I've seen other charts which say exactly the same thing. This one just presents it beautifully. So, Australians have been told that we've got to get off gas to meet net zero because gas is a fossil fuel and blah 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 blah. And it's like, okay, buddy. So 2.6% of Australia's gas goes to residential use, right? 2.6%. 2.6%. It's a rounding error. Meanwhile, we use 7.3% of Australia's gas in our LNG export terminals in Gladstone and elsewhere in WA to basically, because converting gas into liquid for export is incredibly energy intensive, use a lot of energy. So we lose 7.3% of our gas, just convert it to liquid to then put in a ship, to then transport it halfway across the world to sell it to China and Japan and everywhere else, mostly China. And 82% of our total gas goes to export. So, we don't basically Australians use hardly any of it. The residential sector uses a tiny 2.6%. And yet we're being told, in Victoria at least, that Australian households have got to rip up their gas pipelines. They've got to rip up their gas appliances because we've got to meet net zero and it's dirty. It's just absurd. It's like, are you guys for real? Well, here's a better idea. How about we deliver, we have a domestic reservation policy like they have in Western Australia, or even better, how about we put on export levies onto our gas, which basically levies an export, levies an amount per gigajoule that we sell overseas. And that goes into consolidated revenue. And we could suddenly raise billions upon billions upon billions of dollars. And this is exactly what Norway does. So just to take this back one level, sorry, I messed it up. Australia has benefited the most from the commodities boom, right, since the mid 2000s. So this is the terms of trade in Australia in the blue line. That's basically your export prices divided by your import prices. Australia has had a bigger terms of trade boom than any other nation on earth. And that should have flowed to us, and we should be the richest people on earth. And what smart countries do. So I'm talking about Norway here. So Norway taxes its oil and gas exports at about 82%. 78%, I think it is. So effectively, you can see it here. That's Australia. Norway's the bottom one, I should be saying. So the bottom right chart there's Norway. Norway taxes their oil and gas at about 80%. So effectively, they have made oodles and oodles of money from the oil and gas boom. And these charts only go up to 2020. So you can imagine what happened when Russia invaded Ukraine. Norway just made an absolute mint. Australia, on the other hand, which is the top right chart, is basically, we're actually getting less from the petroleum resource rent tax than we got about 10 or so years ago. And that's because it's based on profit, not revenue, right? It should be based on revenue. And, we are effectively not benefiting as Australians from this oil and gas boom. And because Norway taxes at 80%, this is the middle bottom chart there. Norway has a sovereign wealth fund, which basically, so what Norway does is it accumulates all these revenues from the oil and gas exports. It goes to Norwegians. It goes into a sovereign wealth fund, which is on behalf of Norwegians, which is then invested internationally. And that sovereign wealth fund has grown so big that by last calculation, it's worth about 280,000 US dollars per Norwegian resident, right? So they're sitting on an endowment fund, a country of about 5.5 million people, which is basically Melbourne and Geelong, right? It's sitting on a sovereign wealth fund that is worth $280,000 US per resident. And what have we got to show for our boom? We have a lot more resources than Norway, even if you account for our bigger population. We should be the richest people on earth. But because of our idiot politicians, instead, we're left paying $16 a gigajoule this week on our gas domestically, right? When Americans pay $4 Australian for their gas. So we pay 4 times as much. So we get absolutely reamed on our cost of living through gas and electricity, right? And then we don't collect much tax revenue from our resources. It's absurd. We should have the cheapest energy in the world, not including oil, obviously. I'm talking about gas and electricity. We should have the cheapest energy in the world because we're sitting on so much of the stuff, and we should also be making out like bandits from our Australian, our resources exports if we taxed it properly like Norway does. And we could have had a sovereign wealth fund that is ginormous, and we could be sitting on a sovereign wealth fund that is worth, truckloads per person. And I'll tell you this much: if we had a sovereign wealth fund, there's no way the federal government would be running a mass immigration policy, because if you did that, you actually dilute your wealth because you'd be sharing your sovereign wealth fund over more people. But instead, we've made our tax system wholly reliant on personal income taxes. We're the most reliant on personal income taxes in the world. So the Australian Treasury's brainiac solution is, personal income tax is how we raise our tax. We better get more personal income taxpayers in. And the easiest way to do that's through immigration, which then creates all these other problems. It's just moronic. We should just change the tax system and make it more resource-based like Norway. We wouldn't have any bloody revenue shortages. And then we'd have a direct incentive not to run a mass immigration policy, because then that would dilute your wealth directly. So we do everything back to front in Australia. And, I blame our politicians. It's as simple as that.
Right. And you can actually trace it right the way back through the Howard era, where some of the decisions that he made started the deck chairs falling over, as it were. And then subsequent governments just followed and followed and followed and followed.
Unfortunately, the Rudd-Gillard was probably the worst, I've got to say, on this particular policy, because they were the ones that were in when the Gladstone LNG projects were set up. And in fact, Martin Ferguson, who was a resource minister at the time, actually neutered the petroleum resource rent tax. So it made that we collected less revenue, and that's really hurting us now. So, the Labor government in the Rudd-Gillard government, unfortunately, was massively against the domestic reservation policy. And that was, they were pressured by obviously the industry and also the idiots at the Grattan Institute who argued vigorously against it. And so I actually blame, obviously Howard started the right when he signed a few export contracts with China, etc. But unfortunately, most of the blame on this particular topic actually goes to the Rudd-Gillard government. Although I don't think maybe it's cynicism, but I don't think if the coalition were in, they would have done any different. They probably would have done exactly the same. So we're just ruled by idiots, both sides.
Right. And there's a certain paranoia in government as well from the pressure that these large corporates can actually run. We saw a few examples earlier on when, the Minerals Council and other hangers-on were really lobbying very heavily to sort of, steer government in a different direction. And that was in the public domain as well as what they were doing behind the scenes. So first point, a lot of these corporates have huge political clout and can steer politicians quite nicely. The second, of course, is that what they of worrying about, of course, is what they might do on an international basis. And they talk about well, if we added more taxes, then internationally we wouldn't be able to compete, or somehow the credibility of the trade relationships that we have in Australia would be damaged. But it seems to me that those are just massive furphies, because the truth is, you can see now what's happened over the last 20 plus years, and it's not good in terms of the economics, which is why we come back to the high migration as the only lever. And even then, it's also worth thinking about, a lot of these big corporates are actually internationally owned. So a lot of the revenue that's generated goes offshore, not back into Australia or into Australian taxes.
Yeah, and to your point, this whole notion that, it's sovereign risk, whatever. It's like, hang on. Western Australia brought in a gas reservation policy in 2004. The Carpenter government did it. And they basically require that 15% of Western Australia's export gas has got to be reserved for domestic use. Now, it's not perfect. I mean, they don't tax their gas projects properly, so they're not doing what Norway's doing, which is what they should have done. But, they at least have ensured that they've got cheap gas and electricity prices over there. Now, the annoying thing is, the industry is lobbying really hard right now to get that overturned. And I mean, Western Australians would be absolutely crazy to do it. But, there are some rumblings that the government is thinking about getting rid of their reservation policy, which would be an absolute shooting yourself in the foot own goal. Because when Russia invaded Ukraine, Western Australians were insulated from an energy spike. Their energy prices basically didn't go up, and Western Australia just made a little bit more money through their resource rents. Now, Western Australia doesn't collect nearly enough. They should collect a lot more, but at least they collect some through royalties, and they also do have a reservation policy. And to be fair, every single gas exporting country in the world, well, region in the world, I should say, except for Australia's East Coast, has a domestic gas reservation policy. Like, we are the outlier here on the East Coast. And it's the reason why we have rampant energy inflation when other places like the US, Qatar, Western Australia don't, because they actually they have a policy of trying to, look after their own residents first before exporting the rest. And, Norway does it best, because Norway then taxes their resource exports, their oil and gas exports, at about 80%. And they actually have some, government-owned companies, which run those things, whereas we've obviously got it all privatized. But even the private ones have to pay ridiculous, very high taxes. And as a result, Norwegians are uber rich. As I said, they're sitting on $280,000 endowment fund per resident. Well, what do we got to show for our resource boom? We're swimming in resources, and yet we're running budget deficits, and we're always worried about, we don't have enough money to pay for anything, and all this sort of stuff. It's just bonkers. We should be swimming in revenue, and there's no reason why we shouldn't be. And as I keep saying, if we taxed our resources properly, there would be a direct incentive not to grow the population quickly through immigration, because it would dilute your wealth directly. But because we don't tax any of this stuff properly, we don't get that wealth dilution to, nearly the same degree. We get a little bit because obviously we get company taxes from a lot of these resource companies, and that gets spread over more people. But, there isn't that direct link between, if you double Australia's population, you effectively half your wealth, because you'd halve your mineral endowment. Well, that's what you get in Norway, but we don't have that because we don't tax any of this stuff properly. So as a result, the solution to our tax crisis is to import more migrants to become taxpayers to boost the federal budget, which then just pushes costs onto the states and you and me and everyone else. And that is effectively, Australia's failure in a nutshell.
Right. So just thinking about a solution, right, because we are where we are. So the first lever has to be dealing with the energy situation, which means actually getting super profit tax or some other mechanism in to be able to actually generate export levies, and also reservation to be able to actually ensure that there's enough gas locally. Now, of course, those big international companies won't like that, but it seems to me that's got to be number one. And then number two is dealing with the migration issue, because we've had so many people come in. The numbers are still way higher, and as you suggest, the gap between what the government thought was going to be this year and what's likely to be is going to be much bigger than their planning estimate. And if you run the migration numbers forward, even with the slightly lower numbers they're talking about, we've still got continued massive population growth over the next decade or two, which is unsustainable. Whereas,
yeah, well,
go on.
Sorry, just to put some numbers on that. I wish I had that chart in here. I'll put up last month's, but the Intergenerational Report 2023 projected that Australia's population would grow by 13.5 million people in 39 years from now. All right. So 13.9 million people. You go, okay, that's a lot of people. I'll tell you how much it is. Just imagine adding a current Sydney, a current Melbourne, and a current Brisbane, like all the people in Sydney currently, Melbourne currently, and Brisbane currently, to us, and plus I think another 100,000 on top of that. So I don't know what that is, Hobart maybe, to Australia's population in just 39 years. Like that is an extraordinary amount of people. It has taken Sydney 1788, whatever that is. Sorry, math, I've got to think about it in my head. However many years, was that 240 years or something, to get to its current size. So what we're going to, but we're going to add that and a Melbourne and a Brisbane in just 39 years. That is the official projection from the Intergenerational Report. Now, I'm sorry, but 13.5 million people is going to require about 5.5 million new homes, right? In that time, especially if you account for demolitions. How are we going to meet net zero? Like this whole BS about, Australia's going to be net zero by 2050. It's like, hang on, you're going to build 5.5 million homes. You're going to have to build oodles of infrastructure, right, for another 13.5 million people. Otherwise, we're going to live like they do in Calcutta or something, right? So we're going to have to build, oodles of infrastructure. We're not going to have enough water. So we're going to have to build desalination plants everywhere, which is going to use a ton of energy. I mean, do you get the drift here? Like this whole notion that Australia can magically go down to net zero by 2050, when we're going to add 5.5 billion homes, oodles of infrastructure, desalination plants, the whole box and dice. How many cars are we going to need? Oh, yeah, but it doesn't matter. They're all going to be electrified. Yeah, okay. But that still uses a ton of power, energy to create those cars, et cetera, et cetera. And then, so, you get the drift. And then how are we going to fix the housing situation with 13.5 million, Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane in 39 years? It's just not possible. Like, the only way you could do it is if you just, slapped up high-rise Harry, just crap apartments across all of Australia's cities, shoebox apartments, high-rise upon high-rise upon high-rise. And they're going to be very poor quality. And we're going to end up living in, a high-rise future. Is that what we want? I don't think it is. And, this is the whole fallacy of it. So even though the Albanese government says they're going to halve migration back to pre-pandemic levels of, about 250 odd, which is actually higher than pre-pandemic, by the way. But, regardless, thereabouts, that is still incredibly high population growth, because the population growth we had pre-pandemic, the immigration we had pre-pandemic was far too high. And we know it because Australia didn't build enough infrastructure, and we didn't build enough, certainly good quality houses in the 15 years leading up to the pandemic, when net overseas migration averaged 220,000 a year, which was, more than double the historical average. So, this whole notion that no, it'll be fine. We can just, it's all about supply. It's just complete farce. It's about demand. And the fact of the matter is Australians have never supported a big Australia, but we're getting it thrown down our throat. And, it's just a question, is it going to be a big Australia or a huge Australia? And under, the Albanese government, it's a huge Australia. Under Dutton, even if he does his reforms, it'll be a big Australia. But either way, it's too many people. Simple as that. And I don't think, the official projection, I'm a Melburnian, and the official projection, or the state government projection for Melbourne's population, is to grow to 9 million people by 2056. Now, Melbourne's population was 3.5 million at the turn of the century. So in 2000, we had 3.5 million people in Melbourne. It took Melbourne about, it's 170 years to get to its current size. And we're going to go from 3.5 million to 9 million people in just 56 years. Like that is a, absolutely monstrous increase in the number of people. 5.5 million people in just, what's that, 50, um, in just 56 years. It's just not possible to do that without creating a lot of problems, and not just for housing, but for livability and everything else. So that's the reality of the situation. And this is what I want people to understand. Like, I often get called, not by, your viewers, Martin, but I'm always called, oh, you're just xenophobic, or you're just anti-immigration. I'm not anti-immigration. I'm anti-immigration that's too high. And we've had that for 20 years. Just go back to what it was pre-2005 and we'll be fine. That's the long and short of it.
Yeah, and two observations. One, of course, is they're talking about 1.2 million homes over the next 5 years, and a stretch target, which is way below what would be required and impossible to build, as we said earlier on, right? But more broadly, who was asked about this? If you go back to before Albo was elected, he actually was a bit more sanguine on migration, as I recall, and suddenly he turned a sort of a 90-degree turn when he got elected. So unfortunately, politicians say one thing before and then say something else when they're elected. And I come back to this fundamental driver that we touched on earlier on, the Treasury. The Treasury is the fixed point out of which a lot of this strategy is emanating. And I actually think the problem there is that we've got economists in Treasury who have a very myopic view of the world, and focus on the GDP and the tax take, as we touched on earlier on. But it's not good for the people in the country, right? It's not good for the growth of kids in Australia at the moment, who will probably be living in high rise rather than actually in low rise where they can run around, and all of those other things. And I come back to this other point: the infrastructure that you need to build to be able to accommodate this massive inflow would include hospitals, schools, roads, sports centre, everything. So everything. Where are the plans for that?
There are no. Australia's whole plan is just, bring them in and then hope, right? That's all it is. And to your point about the Australian Treasury, they literally set up a propaganda unit within the Australian Treasury called the Centre for Population. Like, it's completely Orwellian. And the Centre for Populations, all it does is it puts out propaganda reports about how great, immigration is, like how fantastic it is for productivity and how fantastic it is for this. And, it's complete BS. Like, the notion that immigration is good for Australia's productivity has been completely debunked, because, Australia's productivity performance since we've run Big Australia has been absolutely woeful. And it's not a coincidence. The reason why Australia's productivity has sucked is because we've had what economists call capital shallowing. So if you don't mind sharing the screen for a sec, Martin, this chart in the top left-hand side was put together by Jared Minack, who's an excellent independent economist, former chief economist of Morgan Stanley. And basically what it shows is that Australia's had what economists call capital shallowing. So that occurs basically when your population grows faster than the rate of business investment, infrastructure, and housing. So effectively, you've got, more people sharing less capital stock per person. And then you end up with, things like congestion costs, or if you think about it, if you're running a cafe or something, just to bring it down to a real basic level, if you've got one, coffee machine, right? And you've got, two staff who share that coffee machine to make coffees, and then you suddenly double the number of staff to 4. Well, then you're going to get congestion on that coffee machine, and they'll have to wait for each other. They end up bumping into each other, and then you don't end up making, although you've doubled the number of staff, you don't double the number of coffees that are made, and your productivity falls. That's effectively what Australia has done with our capital shallowing. We've grown the population at a far quicker rate than business investment and housing and infrastructure, and as a result, Australia's productivity has sucked. And it's falling. And this is the same phenomenon that is happening in Canada. The National Bank of Canada, which is one of their big four banks, or I think it's big five, I can't remember, but one of their major banks over there, did a similar analysis. And I don't have it here. I think I included in the chart pack last time. And it was almost identical as Australia's, like this chart from Jerry Minack. Effectively, Canada has had a massive migration boom like Australia. And as a result, it too has experienced deplorable productivity growth and capital shallowing for exactly the same reason. Population's growing faster than business investment, infrastructure, and housing. And it's creating congestion costs. It's basically lowering productivity. And that's effectively the Australian economic model. And yet the idiots at the Centre for Population, at the propaganda unit, the Australian Treasury, try and Grattan Institute does it all the time. They try and argue that this big migration is actually good for Australia's productivity. It's like, well, no, it's not. It's empirically proven that we've done 20 years of this junk policy, and Australia's productivity is worse than ever. It's collapsed. Well, it's not a coincidence. You can't say, oh, it's collapsed in spite of high immigration, and it would have been worse without the immigration. That's rubbish. It's collapsed. And GDP per capita growth has collapsed as well as a result because of our crap productivity. So, this junk policy has been thrust onto us by, the Australian Treasury, supported by the business lobby, because they get to privatise the gains from immigration, where the costs are socialised and everyone else. The universities, the higher education sector is now one of the new rent seekers. They privatise the gains from, the international student trade, which is one of the main conduits of immigration now, while the costs are socialised on the rest of us. The property lobby, same thing. Privatise the gains, more people, more demand for housing, more. That's why High-Rise Harry is constantly pumping immigration, because he gets him and Meriton gets to privatise the gains. But it's not, who's looking after the welfare of Australians? Like, our politicians certainly aren't. Our central government agencies, i.e. the treasuries around the country, certainly aren't. Nobody's looking after the welfare of Australians. They're all just talking their own book. They're representing vested interests. Or in the case of the Australian Treasury, they're just representing, themselves, trying to basically meet their two main key KPIs, which is to keep the punters coming in, to keep the wheels of the economy turning, so we can keep having GDP growth. Forget about the fact that per capita growth sucks, and that we can, boost the federal budget, because the federal budget collects 82% of the tax revenue. Don't worry about the costs. That is the reason why Australia is in the situation it's in. And it's not just, it's immigration, it's energy, it's a whole bunch of things. It's broader housing policy. It's all broken. And I sincerely fear that Australia is going to basically plunge down the developed country rankings. I think we already are, really. But it's going to continue. Like, us and Canada are just we're both doing the same stupid policies. And we're going to end up just grinding us, falling down the developed country rankings, becoming, we'll still be a developed country, but just becoming less livable, less advanced, and just basically an underperformer. I think that's Australia's future, unfortunately. And it shouldn't be, because we are one of the richest resource countries in the world. We should, as I said earlier, be the richest nation on earth, at least, wealth per capita. But we're not, because we give it away. We don't tax any of this stuff properly, and then we gouge it. We allow these companies to gouge us, so that we end up paying expensive prices for everything when we're swimming in the stuff that we're selling to the rest of the world. It's just crazy.
Yes, and no real sense of any change of direction from either of the two bigger parties. You could argue they're on the same side here, right, in terms of the way that they think about it, which means that the political leverage to make change is actually quite limited at the moment, insofar that both major parties are actually very much on the same sort of point. And whilst there are minor differences in terms of energy and what have you, so the question is, how do you actually begin to move the dial? I suppose what we try to do on this channel, and what you do as well, is to try and at least raise some of these issues up to make people more aware, and maybe get people a little angry of how come things have actually not worked. Because people, in my surveys, Leith, I see people really distressed with struggling to try and make ends meet, and really frustrated with their inability to get forward. In real terms, most people are going backwards, but they don't necessarily have the equipment to be able to ask, well, what's really created the problem, right? And what we're trying to do is to argue here, there were political decisions taken over the last 20 odd years that have ended up in this cul-de-sac. And unless we actually understand those decisions and make a change of direction, we're going to get stuck in the cul-de-sac. And that's the dilemma. Now, a lot of people don't want to hear this, but the truth is there are things that could be done, but it goes back to political appetite.
Yeah, 100%. Unfortunately, I mean, look, I guess there's the old term, power is knowledge, right? So when I talk to people, just, randoms, if I go to boxing, whatever, and often I get people saying, oh, what do you do for a living? You tell them, and they're like, oh, okay. And then they start asking you questions and that. And then you sort of get into a conversation with them. And then you tell them some of these truths and they're like, I never. Oh, and then it's like a light goes off. So, I tell them about the gas thing. I'm like, yeah, well, I remember when we used to pay, a gas bill in Melbourne used to be, $200 for 60 days. Now it's 1,000. I go, well, the reason for that is this. And they get angry. They're like, geez, I didn't realize, geez, what a pack of bastards. I can't believe, why do our politicians do this to us and blah, blah, blah. And, it's the same thing. Like, a lot of people know something's not right and they can sense that something's not right, but they don't exactly know, the ins and outs of why. And, once you explain it to them, they usually get it because it's pretty simple, really. I mean, unfortunately, often politicians and lobbyists and all that try to make the simple confusing, because if they make it confusing, people switch off. But a lot of this stuff, when it comes to migration and energy policy and all that stuff, it's actually pretty simple when you break it down. It's like, I often say when it comes to the gas thing, I say, well, if Australia is the equivalent of a Middle Eastern country with on gas, we've got heaps of the stuff, we export 82% of it. Can you imagine a Middle Eastern, like a Saudi Arabian, filling up their car at the petrol station and paying $2 a litre, right? You couldn't imagine that happening because they've got oil everywhere and they export almost all of it except for what they use themselves. And as a result, you can fill up your car for a couple of bucks in Saudi Arabia, right? But we should have a similar situation here where, I'm not saying gas should be free, but it should be very close to the marginal cost of pulling it out of the ground. But instead, it's orders of magnitude above that. $16 a gigajoule on the East Coast currently versus, as I said, Americans pay $4 Australian, or about $2.50 US for theirs, right? So, people know there's a problem, and it's just policy failure. That's it. Like, the politicians have done this to us deliberately. They've set up crap policy. They've set up the structures to basically allow multinational firms to basically come in and gouge us. And, when you tell them that and you say, this is what happens in Saudi Arabia, and can you imagine Saudi Arabians then being told that they got a shortage of oil because they're exporting, the majority overseas, so therefore there's a domestic shortage. And then the solution to that, which is actually one of the solutions now that's been put forward to Australians, is that we need to build import terminals for gas. It's absurd. We've got to build import terminals because we've got a domestic shortage of gas, even though we sell 82% of that gas offshore. Like, can you believe how absurd this is? Like, literally the gas comes out the ground over there and we've got a shortage. And the solution then is to build an import terminal so we can then bring gas from offshore, probably our own gas, after we've liquefied it, to then degasify it, to then bring it back into Australia. Like, that is the moronic policy that we have in Australia now, that there are legit plans to build import terminals to overcome a domestic gas shortage in Australia when we literally export 82% of our gas. And we use 3 times as much gas, turning it to liquid to put on a ship to send to China, right, than Australian households use in aggregate. Like, that is the idiocy of the people that are running this country. We should have, our gas should be at close to marginal cost, should be a couple bucks a gigajoule, and that's it. And if we had that, we'd have competitive manufacturing, because, energy is arguably the key input to a manufacturing sector. It's very energy intensive. And instead, we've made it incredibly expensive. So all the manufacturing shutting down. So then Albo's great brainiac solution is to do his future-made manufacturing policy, where he's going to just throw billions of dollars of your money at his hand-picked manufacturing boondoggle firms to build solar panels and crap like that. in areas that were never going to be competitive, when the solution is really just to deliver cheap energy and let the manufacturers compete on their own. Because if they got cheap energy, they'll survive. But without cheap energy, they're all going to die. And the only ones that will survive will be through government handouts of your money, right? And this whole notion that we're going to magically start building solar panels when our last plastics manufacturer, Quenos, has literally just shut down. Well, where's the plastic going to go that goes into those solar panels? Where's that going to come from? Because that's just shut down. We're going to have to import it from China. You know, this is the absurdity we've got here. I know I'm ranting, but I'm hoping this is making sense, because these are the idiots that are running our country, that are selling us down the river and are basically wrecking our living standards. We're just ruled by morons. So that's the cold, hard facts.
Yeah, driven by idiots. Yeah. By the way, idiots with their own specific agenda. And let me just turn the conversation to one last subject before we go. We mentioned earlier on the one of the reasons why home prices were so accelerated was the high demand because of high migration, right? We have ultra high home prices relative to almost every other country in the world. So you can see that this is also another impact. But we've also now got a precarious situation where if indeed home prices started to go the other way, or indeed defaults started to rise, then the financial stability question would come back into vogue again. And I noticed that the Council of Financial Regulators keeps harping on about financial stability is really, really important, et cetera, et cetera. So I guess one question I have is, if we actually do turn the migration knobs down, and if we start generating income from on some of these other sources, that's going to have an impact on the housing market. That could actually push home prices down. Could we not then create a financial stability event thanks to the stupid policies over the last 20 years as well?
Look. I mean, to be fair, I think the valuations of Australian housing are so absurd now that there's going to have to be some day of reckoning at some point. But at the same time, I think there's always the capacity of the Michelle Bullock put or something yes. to keep the thing alive. So if you don't mind switching over, there's a great chart that Shane Oliver did, and it basically shows the gap between Australian median home prices and borrowing capacity. So the gap's just become record, right? So, this is where I think pretty much the only economist who was right in the country was actually the kook. So pretty much most economists, when the Reserve Bank did their 13 rate hikes, we all thought Australian house prices would fall pretty heavily, and they obviously started falling at the start, and then we had this miraculous rebound. And the reason why most people thought that house prices would fall was because of this borrowing capacity thing. So, basically, borrowing capacity has fallen by about 30% thereabouts since the RBA commenced its, tightening cycle. And yet house prices have risen, which is just very unusual, should I say. And the main reason, I think the reason why they've risen is we've had extreme case of FOMO, fear of missing out, creep in. So we've obviously had record migration, got record low rental vacancy rates, rents are soaring. So basically there's this fear of missing out. Everyone's piling into the housing market because they're desperate not to have to rent, because renting sucks. And then so on the left-hand side there, we've got people borrowing big to get into housing. But then at the same time, we've got bank and mum and dad leveraging in really hard. We've got foreign buyers now have returned into the Australian market. So a lot of them are buying with that, cash purchases, etc. So we've got this basically perfect storm of FOMO, which has driven house prices up despite 13 consecutive rate rises. But the problem with it is, that the prices have gotten so far away from fundamentals, which, is effectively capacity to pay, that they're in dangerous territory, I think. And that being said, there is always the capacity for the Reserve Bank, if the proverbial hits the fan, to obviously slash interest rates back down. I'm talking about Armageddon stuff, right? So, if it looks like we're going to have a crash, there's nothing to stop the RBA from going back towards zero or close to zero, or, who knows? They could follow what they did in some other countries around the world, in Europe, and go negative interest rates. You never know. It's possible. I mean, Will they do it? I don't know. But I'm just saying you can never rule anything in or anything out. And, never bet against the stupidity of policymakers to keep the bubble going is, I guess, my point. Because I've underestimated them in the past and, they always manage to surprise you. So, but based on that chart on the right from Shane Oliver, that is just, obscene valuations we got here. There's a huge gap between capacity to pay and actual prices. And it does look incredibly frothy and dangerous.
Well, certainly. And if I just quickly show you my stress chart, this is the one from the end of May. You can see there that we've got now more than half of people with mortgages having cash flow pressures. And the rental story is 77% of those in the rental sector have cash flow pressures, which is very high. But of course, that isn't the whole population. It's only a proportion of the population. And one of the dilemmas, of course, that the RBA's got is you've got two speeds of economy, right? You've got some households who are not borrowing, not paying rent, who've actually got returns from higher term deposits and, the momentum in the share markets and probably enjoying the equity in their properties. And then you've got this other huge tranche of people who are absolutely caught. So the RBA's policies and lifting interest rates are only squeezing a small proportion of the total population, which is the unequal story that we've got here. And unfortunately, as Michelle Bullock said in her press conference today, we've only got one lever. Well, I'm not sure that's true, but she chooses to say that the lever is interest rates. So if they keep high interest rates for longer, which is what they're probably going to do now, that's going to have more of a direct impact on this smaller cohort that are highly leveraged or are in the rental sector. But you've still got this other sector who's probably spending more than people expected in terms of traveling overseas and doing quite well. So the inflation story and getting inflation beat is definitely not over yet.
No, and to your point, I mean, I think Tarek Brooker's coined the term. I mean, burnout economies, I think, is one, but that's more related to the fact that you got the governments are pumping money in while the Reserve Bank's got the foot plant on the brake. That's his burnout economy. But he also, I think, I remember he coined the term, three Australias. So you've got effectively, roughly 1/3 of Australians who've got owner-occupied mortgages. I'm leaving out investors here. They're obviously getting smashed by, the surge in mortgage rates, right? So they've been absolutely hammered. You got 1/3 roughly who rent, and they're getting smashed by the rental crisis. And obviously we've had hyperinflation in rents, and I'd argue they've actually copped it the hardest because they tend to be lower income earners and the more, younger and more fragile, etc. And then you've got the 1/3 who tend to own the homes outright, and they tend to be, who own the homes outright. So don't have a mortgage and they're not renting, right? Those people tend to be older. So, baby boomers, etc. And they are cashed up to the max, and they're actually benefiting for all the reasons you just said. And I don't have this chart here. I didn't include it. I should have put it in tonight, but the CBA's, survey data, which is based on CBA bank accounts, showed that basically anyone over 60 has spent more than inflation have grown their spending by more than the CPI in the past year, whereas anyone under 60 has spent less than inflation over the past year. And in fact, those who I think under 30 have actually outright cut their spending. So not spent less than inflation, they've just literally cut their spending, which is absolutely insane. And also the Australian Bureau of Statistics Living Cost Index, which is comes out every quarter, and we've got it for the March quarter, basically showed that if you're an employee household, so that's basically, workers, if you're a worker in Australia, on average, your cost of living's increased by memory, I think it was about 6.5% in the year to March, which is, well above the CPI inflation of 3.6%, whereas self-funded retirees and pensioners have actually had a lower cost of living increase than inflation. And that again gets back to this whole mortgage story, the rent story, etc. So yes, it's the three Australias. And unfortunately, if the Reserve Bank, the Reserve Bank effectively is smashing 1/3 of Australians to try and get inflation under control, because 1/3 of Australians have owner-occupied mortgages roughly. And it doesn't impact renters directly. I mean, obviously it does indirectly if you get less housing supply, then you have higher rents going forward, etc. But it certainly doesn't impact, the older Australians who own the homes outright. So it's a very untargeted tool. You're smashing 1/3 of Australians to try and bring inflation under control, while 1/3 of Australians who own the homes outright are spending like drunken sailors. and doing everything they can not to support the RBA. So it's just it's a diabolical situation. This is why as much as we all like to hate the RBA, it's not really their fault. I mean, they've got one tool, I guess, got macroprudential and that sort of stuff. But effectively, they've got a very small tool set to cope with inflation. Really, the blame needs to go on the federal government, because the federal government has lots of tools. I'd argue they're all tools, but it does have a lot of levers at their disposal to get inflation under control. It's got fiscal policy, it's got immigration policy, energy policy, all this sorts of stuff. And it could do it. It's got a lot more, avenues to lower inflation than what the Reserve Bank's got, but they refuse not to do it. And in fact, they're making the situation worse by running, an insane immigration policy and just completely destroying energy policy and pushing up your cost of living. And then their solution is then to throw subsidies at everything. And, I'd argue that energy subsidies, et cetera, they're not going to be inflationary because they're going to lower inflation directly in those areas. But they're not going to do much to lower inflation, because then people will, probably spend the difference. But it is a waste of money. Like, when it's a waste of taxpayers' money, when instead we could just fix the underlying problems. And that's the problem. It's a Band-Aid budget that the state and federal governments are doing, when they should really be fixing the underlying problems that have caused these problems in the first place, i.e. immigration, energy policy, things like that.
Yeah, and that's the point, which is where I came into this thing earlier on about the current game that's in play. There are various sort of fixes being thrown at various things around the edge to appear to be actually doing stuff, right? But the truth is that the core reasons why we've got to where we've got to can be clearly traced back to a number of policy areas, mostly in the federal government's domain. And if they'd actually done something different, or if they do something different, they can steer the economy into a very different future state from where it's heading at the moment. So it does come back ultimately to political willingness to do things differently. And that's actually the critical message I want to sort of underscore from today's show, right? It's not that it's not possible to solve this. It's not possible to solve this if you continue to play the current game by the current rules. But those rules, as we've just demonstrated this evening, are not actually benefiting ordinary Australians or ordinary businesses. They've actually been engineered for different purposes. There is an alternative narrative that could be developed, but only if the game is changed.
Yep, 100%. And it's one of the reasons why I'd never vote for a major party. And by major party, I mean Labor, Liberal, Greens. They're all useless. And, unfortunately, a vote for the Teals probably is equally useless. So, when you cast your vote at the next election, just try and, I mean, do what you want. I'm not going to tell you to do, but, my thing is I always vote for independents, minor parties, etc. I never give my vote to the majors, but unfortunately, the political system we have in Australia, it ends up, the preferences end up going to the majors anyway. So, but at least you could try, just don't give them your vote. All the people who want to make your life worse and aren't willing to address the core problems, and basically, BS the whole time. Yeah. Don't give them your vote. Give them to a minor party, whatever, or independent or something. But at least to make you feel better knowing that you're doing a protest, even if it doesn't end up changing anything. Well,
magicians use a technique called misdirection, right? Which is don't look over here, look over there, right? Or, there was a film called Don't Look Up, right? The point is that politicians want you to look over here and, they appear to be doing lots of exciting things which will actually make your life better. The truth is, look over there, look in those other directions, look at the gas situation, look at the migration situation, and some of the other things we've been talking about tonight. Those are the critical policy areas that should be actually being addressed. So the critical interaction point with politicians is to, ask them, why aren't you addressing these critical underlying issues? That's got to be the sort of the discussion that needs to be had, because they're going to go on doing this misdirection, and there's an elections coming up, and they'll be throwing little gifts here and there, and look at Queensland, there's gifts galore for everybody there, and so there is an alternative, but you've got to actually understand what the game is, and you've got to understand where to look, and unfortunately, politicians want you to look a different way.
Yeah, I will throw Queensland a bit of a bone though. Like there is one great thing they did, and this is what I'd love to see the federal government emulate. So the state budget, was it last year or the year before? I can't remember. They basically, I think it was the two budgets ago. The Queensland state government basically on budget night announced out of nowhere that they were going to lift the coal royalty. So
Yes.
effectively going to bring in a stepped progressive tax system for the coal royalties and exports. And what that effectively did was, because they didn't announce it before the budget, which is the fatal mistake the Rudd government did with the mining tax, they didn't give the lobbyists time to mount a counter campaign, and they just announced it on budget night. They legislated as soon as possible, and it left the coal industry unable to overturn it. And that effectively raised, I think, an extra $10 billion for the state budget. It was brilliant policy. And that's actually how what the federal government should do. And I'd argue that the Queensland government should have doubled down and done that against the gas sector as well, because Australia's East Coast gas is exported through Gladstone in Queensland. And the Queensland government should have just emulated what they did with coal and done it for gas, and just clipped the ticket and raised heaps of money for Queenslanders. And that extra $10 billion was effectively hypothecated back into their energy subsidies. So the energy subsidies were effectively paid for by the coal industry, by the coal exports, which is actually good policy. Now, what I would have loved to have seen is for the federal government to basically do the same thing. Don't announce that you're going to do, copy Norway or do some sort of export levy or whatever. Just do it on budget night, out of nowhere. Just stealth announce it. And when you announce it, make sure that you announce it with sweeteners to the voting base. So say, we're going to do this. This is going to raise, $20 billion, whatever it is. And we're going to use some of this money to schools. Here's this for that. Here's that. Here's a bit of tax relief for, to lower income tax scales, blah, 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 blah. Whatever you need to do. And I guarantee you, if you did that, it'd be very hard. If you stealth announced it on budget night, didn't give any inclination you were going to do it, it'd be very hard for the minerals lobby, the petroleum lobby, et cetera, to mount a counter campaign, because you would have already announced it. And that is one thing that the Queensland government basically gave the playbook of how to do these sorts of policies. So, to their credit, that was fantastic policy by Queensland. And I just wish they took it further. And I wish the other governments in Australia, i.e. the federal government, emulated them with, gas, et cetera.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I think sometimes not signaling a year ahead of what you're going to do, and allowing all of the corporates to lobby back, just do it. And the path is clear. And of course, that's created the capacity for the Queensland government to do some of these other initiatives that they're actually doing ahead of the election. So it is interesting, isn't it? Hey, Leith, I've really enjoyed this conversation, and I come out of it as frustrated as ever, because I know that this is a really important conversation. Unfortunately, not enough people get it, but we'll keep preaching the gospel. If people want to find out more about you and where, what you do, where are the best places to go?
Yeah, cheers. Yeah, thanks for that, Martin. I was fired up tonight. Sometimes you get angry Leith, you get evil Leith, whatever you want to call it. Tonight I was a bit angry, so I fired up a bit more ranty than usual. But if you want to find me, macrobusiness.com.au, post lots of articles there every day. Also, I got a YouTube channel, which is basically just it's nothing like this. It's just my interviews. So whenever I do an interview, I post it to YouTube, just so I've got a record of it. That's how I started it. Creeping up to, I think, 3,700 subscribers now. So it's actually getting up there, given all I do is just interviews. And that is at Leithvo, Leithvo. So that basically will just have all my Sky interviews, radio interviews. This one will probably go on there eventually, et cetera, et cetera. I'm doing a couple of interviews tomorrow. the rest of the week, they'll all go on this YouTube channel. So it's basically my consolidation side of all the interviews I do. So if you want to keep up to date with what I say on Radio 2GB, etc., where we have 10-minute conversations like this on certain topics, that's where to find those.
Yeah, terrific, Leith. Well, thank you very much indeed for your time tonight, and we'll get a copy of this across to you so you can put it up on your channel subsequent, because
to my 3,700 subscribers. It's very small, but
the
anyway,
more the merrier. I tell you what, just you got to start with a few that they'll build. But no, there's a really, really important conversation, and I look forward to having you back on in a month or two's time, a couple of months' time, to be able to actually continue this conversation, because it's really, really, really important. And I come back to this fundamental point that the future of Australia is going to be determined by whether we can actually shift the dial and go down some of these important roads, or whether we actually stay in the cul-de-sac and end up paying more and more tax, have more and more people flooding in the country, having a worse quality of life, and frankly making Australia go down and down and down and down that international list, right? Which is where it's heading at the moment.
It is. Unfortunately, Martin, the idiocy won't end. So there'll always be, lots of topics of conversation for us to have, I think, unfortunately. I wish it wasn't the case, but, that's the way it is. But, mate, I'm always here for it. Just put up the bat signal and I'll be there.
I really appreciate it. Thank you very much. I'll take you offline now, and I'll just close the show. There you go, folks. I enjoyed that. Always enjoy speaking with Leith. He calls it as it is, and these things need to be said. Just to tell you that next week I'll be back on. I'll be bringing the property market to bear. I've got a couple of people potentially lined up, so watch out for that. And of course, my shows in the meantime will be recorded each day and posted, as you see. Just before I go, the dogs, I think, still here. Yeah, well, sort of. They're sort of spinning out of their baskets. So I think they're ready for a walk, but. That was something which we will do very shortly. So thank you very much. Have a great evening. Look forward to seeing you next week. And Lee, thanks once again. This is Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics signing off. Cheerio.